everyone, and welcome to this diplomacy training webinar about human rights, digital rights, and AI, children's online rights. My name is Noam Peleg, and I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and a board member of the DTP. I would like to start today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodial of the land from which I'm joining you today, and to pay my respect to the elderly, past, present, and emerging, and to extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person who is here with us today, or who may be watching the recording of today's talk. This is the second webinar in a series of 3, exploring the impacts of the digital world on human rights. Today, we will focus on the rights, opportunities, and risks that children can experience when interacting online. Before I introduce our 2 distinguished guests, a few housekeeping rules. Please make sure that your microphones are on mute, but please turn your cameras on so we can have a more pleasant learning space. If you have any comments or questions, please share them on the chat function. We encourage a lively conversation, but we'll ask you to be respectful to the speakers and to the other participants in your comments. Following the 2 presentations, we will have between 20 and 30 minutes time for Q&A. During the presentations, we will also share links to resources, the chat, and everyone who registered for the webinar will get an email with all these links and a link to the recording later on. The online world is fascinating. It rapidly changes, and the ways in which children interact and use the online world changes too. A lot of discussions about children in this context focuses on protection and the potential harm that children can suffer and the violation of their rights, especially the right to privacy that they can encounter online. But at the same time, we need to account for the opportunities that the online world presents to children, including opportunities to realize their rights. For example, the rights to education, the right to play and leisure, the right to health, or the right to development. Children in remote locations, for example, can benefit from increased opportunities for interaction, and the same is true for children with disabilities or with underlying health issues that otherwise preclude them from engaging with the physical world. However, there are also dangers in the online space. These include, as mentioned, violations of privacy and other harms through corporate practices and parental oversights, disinformation and misinformation, propaganda, cyberbullying and grooming, and even sexual exploitation. We will discuss all this today, and we are very fortunate to be joined by 2 experts. Our first speaker is Professor Tam Oliver, who is a professor of Internet Studies at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia, and chief investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence for the Digital Child. His current research includes examining the impact of datafications and artificial intelligence on children and childhoods. Professor Oliver will speak about the practices of social media companies and breaches of children's rights of privacy, including the use of data collected and the implications of attempted to regulate these companies. Our second speaker is Dr. Rhys Farthing. Dr. Farthing is policy expert for children's rights, especially around technology and disadvantages. She holds a DPhil from the University of Oxford, where she was a Clarendon Scholar, and an MCS from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is currently the Director of Children's Policy at Reset in Australia, a global think tank working to tackle digital threats to democracy, and she is joining us from Europe at the moment from Berlin. She will address the ways in which the digital world impacts the rights of children in Australia and outline some of the responses in the protection of these rights, both domestically and internationally. Professor Oliver, the floor is yours. I believe you are on mute. Okay.
All right. Is my screen? Oh, all good? Yep, magic. Okay, so yeah, no small task to try and address any of this in 10 minutes. And so I'm going to zoom in on, if you like, the cause celeb of the current moment. So I'm going to get to the broader digital tech landscape through the lens, I guess, of generative AI and generative AI companies as they're currently deploying themselves, if you like. So this will focus predominantly on the negative, just because I think the AI companies themselves are doing an awfully good job at selling themselves as the solution to literally everything in the entire world. So this is a sobering corrective, perhaps. And I'm going to predominantly, let's move these forward. I'm going to comment predominantly looking through the lens of privacy. So thinking about how children's data is circulating within, being captured by, and the broader implications for that within generative AI tools in particular. And at that point, I kind of want to just start by unpacking what AI is and isn't, and how I'm talking about it today. Hopefully, you can all see that image there of what looks like a calculator. And I want you to, as I'm talking, sort of pay some attention to the design of that calculator. It's a calculator generated by one of the generative AI tools, DALL-E 3. And just as I talk, have a little bit of a look at the configuration of the buttons and the numbers. And this, I hope, will help illustrate my point that artificial intelligence isn't intelligence in any meaningful or recognizable human way. It is not a sentient system. It is not alive. These tools don't hallucinate because hallucination implies agency. Rather, they glitch, they produce errors. And this image, if you look at it closely, is a really good example of that, because while it is kind of looks like a futuristic calculator, at the same time, it has 4 2 buttons. It has multiple 5 buttons. And why is this? Because these models have absorbed a whole bunch of pictures of things like calculators. They have some sense of the general sense of what a calculator looks like, but no understanding, no knowledge, no intelligence about what a calculator is. So this is a great representation of a thing where there is some visual representation of a thing that makes absolutely no sense once you look at it the way that it's configured. And this is sort of illustrative then of the way that large language models work. They absorb a whole lot of information and they probabilistically return that to prompts of various natures. Most of the AI companies at the moment are trying to tell us that AI will solve literally everything. And there are impressive novel uses of these tools today in all sorts of different ways. However, the current pitch that in the next few years that AI will become so super intelligent that it will be our partners in every way, including intelligibly engaging with us, is, I think, an enormous furphy and more of a sales pitch than it is anything else. However, there are literally trillions of dollars now invested in these tools. So we're seeing the global energy to try and have them embedded at every layer in every way, which is where they come into children's lives in different ways. Now, I will say that for the center that I work in, we tend to focus on the younger children, so that we've got a 0 to 8 remit, but I will talk a bit about older kids as well. But as that image sort of gives us a sense, one of the many spaces, for example, that younger children might be engaging with AI might be through audio interfaces like a smart speaker, for example. And what we can see in those sort of moments is that the sort of intimacy that can be built and the sort of the barriers that may not be there that we once imagined would be for younger kids sharing private and personal information simply don't exist when you're in an audio space like that. So smart speakers are one of those really interesting terrains where young kids can actually build quite deep and meaningful relationships or senses of intimacy with generative AI tools, because these tools will have a voice, because they can respond in real time, because it's like chatting with a person effectively. It's also interesting that those agent or companion spaces is where we see for older kids, for example, that this is a space where a lot of young people are now turning to these generative tools as therapy bots, as replacements or substitutes when there is such a dearth of access to professional psychological help in Australia, for example. But this is an image and a quote from Mark Zuckerberg, who we will know as the head of Facebook or Meta. And hearing Zuckerberg say, for people who don't have a person who's a therapist, I think everyone will have an AI, is to me deeply terrifying. The idea that a Meta-fueled AI will be tomorrow's therapist for most young people is a scenario where the sort of information, the sort of data, the sort of private information that's being shared to a company that has no credentials in mental health whatsoever is actually deeply terrifying and gives us a sense of exactly what sort of level of private data might be extracted from young people in ways that we just don't have precedents for just yet. This is problematic in all sorts of ways, but partly because these tools are appearing everywhere. The question now isn't where do I go to find AI? It's where do I go to avoid it? It's built into our social media tools. It's built into our operating systems. The current laptop I'm using has a giant Copilot button that I can barely avoid accidentally whacking. But even something like Microsoft Paint, the very thinnest and smallest of applications, now have generative AI flowing through them. And just to emphasize this then through the lens of young children's worlds, we had the announcement this week that Mattel, the toy company that makes Barbie, and OpenAI that make ChatGPT have entered into a partnership. So when the next generation of Barbie starts chatting with kids, Barbie will be back-ended by ChatGPT. And I can pretty much guarantee that there are going to be some predictable, dramatic privacy issues that will arise very quickly as young kids start telling Barbie all of their secrets. Just so that gives you a sort of sense of the way that the landscape's moving right now. It is really hard to untangle privacy when we think about generative AI, just because it's not one-to-one transactional and it's not just the inputs that are happening at that time. The way that large language models are built, they've absorbed a whole lot of data, and then you create the large language model, and then you have other levels of absorption, some of which are happening in real time, so some of which might be during the conversation, but some of which might not be apparent until the next generation of that model comes along. But what we know is that the premise is that these models will only get better by absorbing more and more and more stuff. So they're very thirsty for all sorts of information, including private information that's supposed to teach them how to get bigger and better. And we know that children's data, as much as it's not supposed to be captured, is very much being hoovered up in this process, not least of all because there is the current presumption that kids under the age of 13 are not users of generative AI. The terms of use say that they shouldn't be. And yet I think most of us will know some young kids that have been playing with these tools in some capacity in some ways. Just to underscore how dangerous I think large language models can be, not just in terms of privacy, but in terms of other things like mis and disinformation, I want to just show you one prompt, one response to a prompt that we ran last month. This is in ChatGPT 4 using their image generation tool. This on the left is a response to a prompt to draw an Australian's house. Pretty, white picket fence, red brick house, pretty bog standard. If we ask the same question, but we ask for an Indigenous Australian's house, same tool, same model, this is what we get. So it gives you a sense of the way that data has been absorbed and the way that Indigenous Australians, for example, are represented inside this large language model. It's not to say these tools have to be sexist or racist or biased, but the way that they've been designed today very much is and very much perpetuates many of these biases and harms. How are we going? Oh, so I'm already over time. Sorry. Okay. So last thing I want to say then, just to drag this back to the question of social media, is that while we know that the social media ban is coming in Australia and that is meant to address some harms, we already see companies like X or Twitter and Meta and Facebook offering up and generating standalone AI apps to be in place. So if their official app, if Facebook and Twitter or X disappears, we've already got a different way that company is expecting to extract data from Australians, including young Australians and children. There are other things we've written, you can read them later, but I just wanted to shout out really quickly, just because we dropped a report last week, that there is a new report, Children and Generative AI in Australia, Big Challenges, which you can find at that address if you're so interested. And I apologize for taking slightly longer than I should. Reese, I'll handball it to you now.
All right, thank you very much. And yes, Reese, the floor is yours.
Oh, I have to unshare, hang on. There we go.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Reese. I'm from an organisation called Reset Tech Australia. We do very boring stuff. Don't invite me to dinner parties. I do digital policy issues and thinking around how we create policy solutions for all sorts of digital problems, including ensuring that children's rights are realised. I've got 10 minutes and I absolutely knew that Tamar was going to sort of nail what are the issues, what are the sort of contexts and experiences that young people have. So I'm going to offer a really boring policy perspective. So I apologise in advance. Roll your shoulders, get ready, we'll get in. Now, having said, I'm not going to sort of dive into children's rights. I will start there just because I think it's a good place to go. So I created this very boring diagram here. Can people see that? All right, brilliant. So I know there's a child rights framework that you're all deeply familiar with, stemming from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That often outlines children's rights in, 3 or 5 pillars, if you were. There's rights to protection, as Noam mentioned, protection from violence, from harmful practice, but also protection under the law. There's rights to participation, so, the right to be heard, which we all think about, but also the right to freedom of expression and freedom of information. There's also provision rights, right? Like the right to have access to things like education, healthcare, social services. And then, depending on the framework you use, there's these 2 sort of procedural rights piece around, best interests being consideration of decision-making and non-discrimination. And so that's sort of just a framework of children's rights. I think we're all sort of slightly familiar with that. Does this feel vaguely familiar? All right, good. Now I'm going to offer up, just for the sake of keeping things in lists and 3 being the magic number, a holy trinity of policy silos which this fits in. So if you think about digital policy, we actually end up in largely thinking in 3 areas. So we think about privacy policy. That's a big area where we do tech and digital regulation. Online safety policy, and then competition policy is the third. Now, these 3 policy silos that exist sort of broadly across the world each engage children's rights in their own unique way. So they offer an opportunity to either advance children's rights in the digital age or occasionally hamper and, take things a little bit backwards. So I thought I'd spend my 10 minutes doing a bit of a deep dive around these policy areas across the APAC region. Does that sound good? Brill. All right, so super quick one first, privacy. Now, privacy is often bracketed out from children's rights. I have no idea why we often talk about children's rights online and privacy, but I assure you that privacy is a right that children have in their own right. Article 16 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child ensures that. But privacy policy itself is increasingly being used as a way to deliver I guess what you'd call platform accountability, so looking at big tech and social media and those sorts of things, but also AI and immersive tech regulation. The general sort of foundation here is that AI platforms and most large tech runs off using people's personal data, to which we have an existing rights and legal protection framework. So the work of a policymaker in this space then is to revise, reinforce, rewrite, reapply privacy policies such that they bring AI and platform uses of personal data to heel. So to try and work a little bit around the system of how these things work to bring them to heel. So this is both a retroactive approach, so to curb some of the harms of a sector that's been a little bit runaway, but it's also proactive. So you see a lot of places where policymakers are putting in place, guidelines and guardrails for future innovations that require the use of personal data. So this existing silo, if you will, this existing policy space for children, this is where we see things like a lot of innovation happen. So in Indonesia, for example, they have their, Indonesian age appropriate design code, which I've sort of listed the formal name there, which is government regulations on electronic systems implementation for children. In Australia, we've got a draft children's online privacy code passing through at the moment. And we also see in China, for example, there's a flat out just child protection. There's a data protection law that has a really strong element for children as well. And so the idea of these sorts of policies is that by asserting regulatory reforms that offer stronger protections for children's data, you start to address the systems that this technology relies on. It's intended to be an upstream approach. So, you know, that old metaphor of you can either put ambulances at the bottom of a cliff or guardrails at the top of a cliff. It's meant to be that kind of guardrails at the top of the cliff approach. That by, you know, creating safer uses of data, you create products that are more rights realizing. But it's often, let's be honest, it's incredibly unsexy and geeky in work. Like, who wants to talk about privacy policy? And it makes it a really hard sell to the public. So if we go back to the 3 Ps of children's rights, if you will, and start to think about where we see these, in terms of protection, that's really where this approach to policy is really rooted. It's about protecting children's data from misuses and detrimental uses, including and especially commercial exploitation. This seems to be where we think about, okay, if you want to tackle surveillance and the sort of the detrimental business model, this is the approach you take. In terms of provision, this can be what sets privacy policy approaches apart from other approaches. Privacy is generally used as a policy tool that aims to protect children within the digital world. So ensuring that actually their access to the digital world, the provision of digital services, is still available to them in privacy realizing ways, rather than talking about limiting access to the digital world. So in terms of provision, we tend to see this being used as a policy silo to sort of advance that. And then participation. Look, it depends on how it's done and what regulation that's there. I just want to point, you know, so often we hear bad news. I'll point to a sort of good example. In Australia at the moment, where we're drafting the Children's Online Privacy Code, where I think we saw some really nice examples of participation in the consultation around that, where the regulator, the Privacy Commissioner who's drafting that code, actually deliberately set out to consult with children and young people first, before they spoke to academics, before they spoke to industry about what this code might look like. So you can start to see some examples of how participation can be realised through privacy rights, but it depends on the regulator and the legislation. If we move on to the world of online safety, this is a terrain of experience that tends to focus on what children actually do online, their experiences on the online world. So whereas privacy focuses on the stuff that happens behind the screen, like what's the data, what's being taken, we might not see it, it can be a little bit invisible. Online safety tends to focus on what's on the screen and what people see and what they do as a result of what they see. So it's focusing more on, you know, what content is provided, what users, who the users are, what the users do, those sorts of things, whereas privacy tends to get a little bit about the geeky system behind things. Now, the OECD, I'm sure you all know this, has a typology of the 4 C's of online harms. So that's harms caused by content, contact, conduct, and commercial use. And these tend to fall into the terrain of online safety. So compared to privacy, which is just where we started, online safety then becomes a little bit trickier, because you start to see we're talking about contact risks and we're talking about content risks. And it's a little bit trickier, particularly at the moment, because regulating content creates a really huge political debate that's, you know, quite fraught in the current global climate. But there are some APAC examples of regulation in this space. So Australia, for example, in 2015 and then revised again in 2021, we passed the Online Safety Act, which covers, you know, many things, but broadly 5 types of content are covered. So child bullying, CSAM and grooming, so child sexual abuse material and grooming, terror material, adult abuse, those sorts of things. And we created a commissioner that's got a brief to enforce that regulation, but also do education for children and young people. Fiji, unbeknownst to a lot of people, also has an Online Safety Act, but as far as I can see, and I'm not an expert in the Fijian law, it's a model that sort of offers up a commissioner to look at the education and support piece rather than, you know, content regulation. And then Malaysia, well, Singapore has an Online Safety Act, but Malaysia also just last year passed an they passed an online safety bill that's waiting for royal assent, I think is where it's at the moment, but it has ruffled some feathers in civil society. It aims to address harmful content like CSAM, financial scams and harassment. but also content that could cause fear or alarm, and that will require content moderation and various things. So you can see this is where you start to get into the space where you're like, oh, this one can be contentious. But if you look at the 3 C's of children's rights within that, protection, whammo, this is sort of really squarely where it's about. This is increasingly what online safety acts are trying to do. They are trying to protect children, to set minimum sort of requirements for what products can be. But they're also trying now in this space to protect children through setting minimum age requirements. So actually protect children by removing access to these sorts of products. And this has sort of knock-on effects for platforms and the way, and for children's realization of the online world, particularly for children's access to provision. So online safety is meant to be, or is more about making sure that services offer safe products to kids, but it's become a world where I think increasingly policymakers are looking at it as a world to ban provision for children and young people. So you can start to see some tensions in the online safety domain when it comes to children's rights. And again, participation depends on the country, depends on the regulator. But I know that just as, again, to keep it to good examples, the e-safety commissioner in Australia, who has carriage of the Online Safety Act, has set up its own youth reference group, which it sort of consults and defers to. So you can see ways that participation can be structurally built into this. Lastly, and I'm looking at time, I promise you, is the world of competition. Now, I've put a question mark there because I often think of competition law. It's a really big area of law and digital policy, but for children's rights, I think it's a sleeper. I don't think we've seen it used that well. And I think this is partly because children's rights policy doesn't really speak too often the language of economics, which is the language of competition law. So I think quite often child rights experts come from legal backgrounds or social science backgrounds, and this tends to be a terrain we're more familiar with, whereas economists dominate in competition law, and there's been a sort of cultural mismatch between the two worlds. But I think really we've got to start to find a way to bring the area of competition law to start to think about how can we use that to advance children's rights in the digital world. And I think we have many reasons to gain, partly because it's partly because we should. This is a conversation we should be in. But also when you get economic debates on your side, you start to bring treasury and finance departments and the departments in the government that tend to have a bit more clout than your media and communications departments or your privacy departments. And if we can bring competition law to the world of children's rights in the digital world, I think we'll start to see a few reforms. We have seen little bits of this in the US, where the FTC in America started to do requirements around, in some cases for the US, in some states, they've got age-appropriate design codes where they're looking at, or, you can look at the Californian consumer law, which has done really good thing for children's data and data brokering. So there's been some really good movements in the US sort of using this approach, but I don't think we've seen it that much in the APAC region. So that was my whistle-stop tour of where policy intersects with children's rights in the digital world. But I'm looking at the time and I'll hand it back to Noam so we can open up for questions and comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Reese, for this presentation and for the overview, and thank you, Tama, as well for your presentation. Right, as said and as Claire mentioned in the chat, please, everyone, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to plug them in the chat, and we'll take it to the speakers. And while you gather your thoughts, I think I'll start with a question for Tama, if you don't mind. So your presentation spoke about a lot about the AI and the risk that AI brings to children's rights and data, mainly in the space of data collection, and some of the outputs that the different AI platforms present with all their biases. And I was wondering whether in your research, in your latest report, or in other pieces of your work and the work of your team, you came across some new opportunities for children that AI and the current stage where the digital world is at, that different opportunities that it presents to children, opportunities that they may not have had in the past.
Oh, look, I think the generative capacities of AI do open a whole lot of doors that simply are open in new ways, perhaps. I think the go-to example always ends up being digital storytelling, where a class might collaboratively produce images to a story more or less in real time, and be able to incorporate themselves into that story through in a way that produces visuals and content that is incredibly compelling and inclusive in a way that you just wouldn't be able to do in other ways. We see some really used well, voice interfaces are actually incredibly exciting. It often gives younger people access to information in ways that they wouldn't as directly be able to access, because often there's sort of a text and typing barrier that's simply presumed to be there. So if these opportunities are configured well, then they can be incredible opportunities. So that there is a reason why these tools are so exciting. But I just think that the speed at which they're rolling out means there needs to be some sober thought about exactly what's happening in the backgrounds as well.
Thank you. Reese, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I just thought I'd add, I did some research recently, I mean, outside of APAC, but in the Caribbean, where we asked young people around their use of AI in the classroom and what they thought. And I thought it was really interesting because they only had positive things to say about it. And the two that sort of really struck a chord with me was, one was, there's a large language cohort in the Caribbean for whom their education system is just creaking. They don't have Spanish speaking content, but there's a lot of Spanish speaking students, and AI for them literally transformed their experience in the classroom because they could suddenly understand the teaching materials, what they were being asked to do, and they went from feeling like aliens in the classroom to actually understanding why they were there. And then the other one that I thought was super cool was that for education systems where there's a lot of rote learning, which I think tends to be a lot of them, AI just absolutely shatters that approach, because these kids were just saying, if you get something boring from a teacher that says, do this instructional thing, you just get the AI to do it. And I'm like, oh, like what a fantastic use of AI to just remove the kind of the grind that we have accidentally built into the standard education system. It's just no longer even plausible to keep that in there. So I think there are some really curious opportunities as well.
I think this is interesting point of, I think, also demonstrates some generational gap, and also reflecting the two questions that we got at the chat about the ways in which we as adults think and use AI in our line of work, in our everyday research, and it depends on what we do as an academic, or as a researcher, or as a policy advisor, and what children do with AI, and that might be completely different. And the instruction that we have for them and give them in the educational setting are not catching up with the ways in which they are using the digital world and the opportunities it presents. And that can create some anxiety for adults, because children are 5, 10, 15 steps ahead of us in the ways in which they use these devices, and we are not catching up. So IDA, for example, asks about the impact on AI on the intellectual ability of children. Well, instead of doing research, which I think assumes going to the library and flicking through encyclopedias, they would just use AI. And Tama mentioned the biases that AI has. So the sort of information that it produces can be biased or untrue or unverified, or distorted, or just completely rubbish and nonsense, and all the spectrum of unreliable information that children can get from. And the question is then, what do we do with that? I mean, if that's the current stage of things on the one hand, and an increasing usage of AI in the classroom on the other hand, and on children's leisure time, how do we create a mechanism, even if on temporal basis, where positive usage or productive usage or unharmful usage of AI can be presented or maintained? If
I
anyone
think
would like to.
the entire educational sector across every level is wrestling with what are good and bad uses. And I think, unfortunately, the GPT is going to write all the essays was the sort of the fear response that we had across the sector. And I think it was sort of unhelpful, because it meant that policing around AI became the big conversation to start with. But I do think the opportunities it presents are vast. And I look in at my own kids. I've got a year 11 student who's just had his first set of exams and was incredibly stressed out by the whole process. And he used these tools to help him design a study schedule so that he could have because he just couldn't figure out how to use his time well. And then he developed a whole lot of study materials with me and him using the tools to produce just Q&A stuff through these tools so that it would allow him to study in the way that he found most productive. I just think it's an anecdotal rather than researched answer, but it does show that some of the things that these tools can do can supplement and enhance the way that education works now, not just displace. Now, it is true that access to information might get easier in some ways, but that's also what we said the internet was going to do. And I think we've seen the internet has changed the way that education might work, but it's not made everyone stupider. Or maybe it has, I don't know. It doesn't feel like it's made everyone stupider. Let's say that with some vague confidence at this point in time.
I also think what's interesting is thinking about, and I know that there's a lively debate about what's the purpose of education and all sorts of things, and I don't mean to sort of diminish that. But if one of the purposes of education is around preparation for future work, right? Like we are preparing young people to have meaningful employment in the future and these sorts of pieces, we need to somehow grapple with the unimaginability of how AI is going to transform the workplace. So I sit now, I'm a researcher. We do all sorts of different research, but one of the things we do at Reset Tech Global, not sort of necessarily Australia, is we have a huge data science team. And I'm noticing in this team that collaboration with people or getting people to do things is increasingly becoming an expensive choice. And you do it for a reason, right? You do it because you're trying to train people up, or you do it because you're trying to bring people along on the journey. If I want an answer to any of my data science questions now, it is much easier for me to task one of my AI agents to go through, build a classifier, find me on this, which is the CSAM adjacent content that whatever it is you need. It is much easier to do that with an AI agent now than with what would have previously been like a staff member, right? And so you start to think, okay, well then in that world, what is it that people will actually do? And every single staff member, even your sort of, graduates coming out from school or uni or wherever, will in effect be managers of AI agents, right? Like that's how the workplace is, for a lot of people, going to look in the future. And in that sense, if that's what you're going to be expected to do for a long part of your career, maybe managing AI agents or working out how to work with them is something that the education system should be encouraging and using. Like, I don't know, I just sort of put that out there that, the workforce is going to change dramatically as well, particularly certain sectors. And if people, if we're trying to train young people to move into them, actually familiarity with how to think with AI, I think is an incredibly important skill they're going to need.
I think that's very useful. That's the end. I mean, in some sense, I mean, we know where the workplace is at the moment, but the kids who are at school now and in Palmer's jurisdiction is 0 to 8. I mean, they will go into the workplace within 10 or 20 or 25 years from now. Who knows where the workplace would be? But the question is how they then should engage with this reality at the moment with a formal educational setting and in their daily life. And there's a question here about their social interactions, what devices, I think, in the online world do what they do to social interactions, whether it's good or bad. I mean, again, there's a question of harm and opportunities here that we can explore further. But then if we as adults don't know what to do and how to digest these changes, how can we then transform almost instantly the educational system that will, on the one hand, protect child rights, those that you identified as privacy and all the other rights that are at play here, and at the same time prepare them for the really unknown. It's unknown for children, it's unknown for us adults as well. I'm getting students now in their early 20s, and what they're doing with devices, I just can't understand. But I know I need to prepare them to go into the legal world, which changes all the time. But they came with a certain set of skills and expectations from high school, which is just graduate from, and we confine them for a set of rules that from their perspective is just anachronistic, it's just not relevant to their life whatsoever. But going back to square one, I think we regain the focus on children and their rights, and I want to ask a question about protection. Along the lines of what Mark put in the chat, but to broaden the discussion a bit further about harm that children can experience online. Sexual harm, sexual exploitation, but also question of deep fake and sexting between children. And there was a question about social interaction, and I will end with that. I mean, children use the opportunities that AI provides for them for creating deep fake of their peers, circulating pictures, circulating images, true or false, with their peers that are modern versions of old school bullying. Playground bullying has become an online bullying. So there is a question here about adults and children harm, but also there is a peer-to-peer harm, where with the new opportunities that AI provides to these horizontal or vertical relationships and the harm that they can manifest. If Tam or Reese want to pick up on that.
I'm pausing, Reese. Do you want to go first?
I mean, sure. I think there's a sort of world. So what, as you mentioned, a lot of these sort of harms are sort of modern extensions of long-standing things. You know, playground bullying has moved online and these sorts of things. So there's a layering of sort of new harms onto old existing templates. Somewhere it's almost the same, it's just a new form. And then somewhere it's sort of layered differently and created new inequalities, new ruptures, new sort of fissions, and new ways for harms to be either, you know, quantitatively or qualitatively new, or at least so quantitatively different that that they feel new. And I think this is really the space where regulation exists, right? Or where regulation ought to exist, to try and create solutions that require, by and large, it's tech platforms, AI companies, these sorts of things, to put in place the guardrails, because the difference between the digital world and the old school world, so those new layers of harms that can emerge versus what used to be, is that the digital world is a commercialized private space. There is no Australian public space for Australian kids to work that runs under the rules of Australia, right? Like, largely digital spaces are run by commercial companies, and commercial companies have a profit incentive that will, you know, by its very nature, privatize the profit and externalize the harm. Right. And that is where you start to see the role of regulation. You need regulation that says, okay, well, if you're going to build AI that does X, Y, Z, you need to make sure that you've got checks in that it can't generate nudity deep fakes, you know, ABC, all of these things that we can regulate. And we see in different parts of the world, they're starting to regulate. The APAC region is really far behind, right? Like, I would say that kids are better protected from these harms in Europe, infinitely far and away. And I can, you know, list 10 really simple examples where kids have protections if you're in Europe, but if that same kid gets on a plane and comes to Australia, they are not protected. You know.
So what are the top 3 examples then?
Privacy settings. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you are a 17-year-old and I pick up my phone here in Berlin and I create a new account on a platform, it will default to private because it has to. There is a law that says privacy settings have to be high by default in Europe for European kids. If you're a 17-year-old who happens to do the same thing in Australia, you are down to the luck of the platform. Some platforms say, oh, do you know what? Okay, we will make you private, but some don't, right? It's just up to the platforms to decide whether they want to realize your best interest in these sorts of places, right? Content moderation is another piece. If you report a piece of harmful hate speech in Europe, if you're a European kid who does that, or, you know, your digital context, it gets taken down more frequently than if you report it in Australia, where we have no specific content moderators working. You know, well, by and large, depending on the platforms, I should say, but just the requirements that regulation places on platforms to behave, if you will, means that we tend to see platforms behave better in those countries than where we don't. And, you know, it's diverse and it's different. If an Australian young person reports a piece of bullying, they've got much stronger protections than a European young person reporting a piece of bullying, because the Australian Online Safety Act operates differently to the Digital Services Act, right? So there's strengths and weaknesses, but by and large, the APAC region is sort of lagging behind in regulation, and that means that children are not protected. And that includes, as Mark's piece pointing out, like requirements that evidence of crimes are not destroyed, right? That is a piece that you can put in regulation. I'm not sure that many adults are using privacy as a legal defense to destroy evidence. I think it's adults destroying evidence because they want to destroy evidence and possibly throwing the word privacy in as they describe why. I don't think it's the proper use of the concept of privacy or the legal protections that privacy offer. But you can regulate this stuff, right? Like where you've got companies that are this large, this powerful, it's going to take the might of a nation state to bring it to heel for the public interest. I just don't think there's any other way.
I mean, thank you for that. And in the language of human rights, we have a framework which can be challenged, which can be questioned about its utility, about its merits, about its logic, about business human rights. So the framework of regulating private spaces to ensure that private entities protect the rights of everyone, including children, is usable, is exist, and it can be applied and should be applied in the context of multinational companies that can produce harm for children, and the activity by definition can violate the rights of children. Tama, did you want to jump in on this one as well?
It's worth commenting that it's kind of an interesting moment in the Australian regulation space when the age restriction for young people on social media is a sort of a legal framework or a legislation that came into existence not knowing, like it wasn't premised on understanding how something would happen, something simply that there should be an outcome. And I think it's an interesting moment where the defense of tech companies for a long time has been, oh, there's no technical way to do that. You can't legislate something that just can't be done. And I think it's an interesting moment where the Australian government, for perhaps questionable reasons, but nevertheless has put legislation in place that says, here's a thing that you can fix every other thing with data. You must be able to do this thing. We're simply going to make a rule that you have to do it. And now we're in that interesting limbo where the spinning up of having to make this thing work is being figured out. But I think as watching legislation move through that doesn't explain itself in technical terms, simply that there must be an outcome, gives us perhaps some hope that tech companies saying, we know better and we know you can and can't do things is no longer enough. And I think that's an optimistic way of seeing what the age restriction coming might entail.
So Tama, for those who are unfamiliar with the age restriction, can you just give us like a 2 minute explanation of what it's supposed to do, given that the clock is ticking and it should come into force quite soon, what it's supposed to do and what it does? I mean, and despite its title, catchy title, what it doesn't do.
Yeah, so the what generally gets called the social media ban for under 16s, but is not actually the name of the legislation, is supposed to prevent Australians under the age of 16 from being able to hold social media accounts on the big social media platforms. The actual exact list of platforms isn't quite finished yet, and the exact mechanisms for doing that is also deeply unclear. So we're not quite sure if this will be an age assurance thing where children will have to prove their age, or indeed older people will have to prove their age, or it's going to be inferred somehow, which is the sort of the dream that maybe you can sort of figure it out from other signals. There is a separate trial going on about that, which is not just about that, but is supposed to give us some technical solutions that may or may not work. But yeah, it's supposed to fix a whole raft of online harms. It was supposed to fix cyberbullying, and it has no way of addressing that issue at all. At best, it might address the idea of algorithmic harms where kids sort of go down an algorithmic spiral of looking at particular types of content that can take them in darker and darker places. But I think it's fair to say it's not particularly well-written legislation, but it is responding to a perceived social need, especially by parents, to address their anxieties around children rather than children's need in particular. So it's an interesting moment in time. It is not, as I say, perhaps the best written legislation in the world, but the fact that it has to work somehow and it kicks in December this year means that a lot of things will fall into place before then, or at least we imagine they will. Yes.
And there were also lots of criticism from service providers for children, saying that this legislation, who assumably will prevent children under 16 from opening new accounts in social media websites, will also result in denying children access to services and to help for information. Children who need some help for mental health issues or reporting bullying or reporting abuse at home, when at the 80s, when we pick up the phone and call the helpline, this is not how children seek information or ask for information today. They will go on the social media sites of different organizations and will DM them with their request. But if by the virtue of being banned from Instagram, being banned from Facebook now, they won't have access to this information and to these services, which can result in further harm to children or lack of access or reduced access to services that can enhance protection for the right. So in that, I mean, and then there is a whole issue of what actually the ban will, I mean, on which platform the ban will apply, which is social media. The old school, adults' understanding of what social media websites are. So messaging apps are not banned. So peer-to-peer bullying can continue. Other platforms like gaming apps, and we have mentioned gaming so far, are not part of this legislation as well. When there is lots of interaction with adults, identify or non-identify adults, with opportunities to interact with adults and between anonymous users, and opportunities for grooming and for sharing of deepfake images are part of this platform, so they are outside scope. So I think, as you said, it's an interesting experiment here, but I think it's very limited in its imagination, partly because it was based on how adults understand as parents, anxious parents understand what the online world is. Reese, if you want to pick up on that, and also maybe to address Patrick's questions about the UNGP's framework.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was just, the social media ban, or the approach of the social media ban, which is not just Australia, that it's, there's multiple US states that are trying this approach as well, that have passed this, is, I think, really interesting. And it's a missed opportunity to pick up some of that systemic reform. So as you mentioned, like requirements that would make platforms across the board be safer, tackle deep fakes, do all of that sort of things, change the systems that these platforms do by just saying, okay, well, we won't do that. We'll just kick kids off this certain set of platforms. It, might address some particular harms, but it creates access for provision. It creates difficulties for provision. But it also just shifts a lot of the problem to other platforms that, to be honest, in a lot of our testing seem to be more unsafe than traditional social media platforms. But, there you go. On the piece around complaints being made, I mean, I don't know. The OECD guidelines, I don't think anyone can make a complaint to the OECD, can they? Like, what are the complaint mechanisms? Where I know that complaints are being made is where regulators have passed legislation, either in the privacy space or the online safety space, to an extent the competition space. There are complaints being made on behalf of children and young people and their rights. So, we see investigations being launched into most of your large platforms under the European Commission, partly around risks to minors. So we see complaints in those spaces. We see complaints in the UK being made against age-appropriate design codes, so looking through privacy spaces. We see lots of regulators starting to do inquiries and those sorts of pieces. So I think those are the mechanisms, but I don't know, like, okay, each OECD country has a complaint, and what can they actually do? Like, I mean, one of the things we have with the issues with regulators is that, I'll take Australia as example. Australia's E-Safety Commissioner, which has, by Australian standards, some really strong powers, can issue walloping fines of up to $610,000. We're talking about platforms with trillion-dollar valuations that, cop $3 trillion fines for GDPR violations that don't, it doesn't even touch the sides. I don't know, I'm not familiar with that complaint process, but one of the things we see perpetually with regulators around the world is, unless they have two particular types of powers, platforms tend to ignore them. One, which is fining mechanisms that are based on global turnover. So we get a lot of regulators now that have the power to issue fines of up to 10% of global turnover. That is large enough to make these really huge platforms listen. Or some regulators have turn-off powers. Like, in exceptional situations, if they've tried everything, they've tried the fine, the non-compliance is still there and it goes to court, they can issue a turn-off situation where ISP, so internet service providers, have to turn off access to that platform until it becomes in compliance. That tends to make them listen. So it's just a really unique sector, I think, that just by virtue of money has a lot of ability to not not play nicely with voluntary sort of codes and requirements.
Thank you for that. We're getting close to the end of the hour, so one last question for the both of you. If you could choose one reform or one change in the ways in which we regulate the online space to make it safer to children and more child rights friendly space, what would you do?
That's a good question.
Anyone in the chat would like to offer some reforms, be my guest as well?
We put out a report that said that there's 5 essential pillars, if I can have 5 as a thing. One, which was you need some sort of overall legal requirement for accountability, whether it's a duty of care or a requirement to realise fundamental rights like they do it in Europe. You need an onus of responsibility on these platforms and tech companies to do the right thing. You need to dovetail that with risk assessments and risk mitigation measures in the risk assessments, because so much of this stuff, otherwise you just end up reacting to harms that have happened. It's got to get proactive. And then because of the nature of this sector, you need incredibly strong requirements for transparency, because no one knows what happens inside these companies or what they see in their data, except if they're compelled to actually meaningfully share it in really strong ways, particularly with regulators and the public. And then your accountability measures, as I mentioned, have to be off the clock, or you won't even, you'll get some junior lawyer paying the fine without even escalating it internally, so the company knows there was a compliance issue.
Thank you. Reese, Tamar? Reese mentioned 5, so it gives you some time to think. Yep.
I'll put an old one on the table that I still think has merit, even though I know it will almost never happen, which is the right to be forgotten. I think the idea that young people have the right to simply jettison all the data that they want to get rid of when they turn 18 or a particular age is still incredibly appealing. The idea of making childhoods online something that don't haunt you and linger the rest of your lives is incredibly appealing and incredibly enabling for digital spaces to be open for education and play in a way that simply isn't when that data trail haunts you forever. So I still think the right to be forgotten is an ideal one, even if I don't know how you would achieve it.
So with this optimistic and futuristic note, I think it's time to bring this conversation into an end. Professor Tamar Lever, Dr. Wright Fretting, thank you very much for joining us today and for having this conversation about the rights of children and the online world. Thank you everyone for joining us today or for watching this recording. And thank you very much for my colleagues from the Diplomacy Training Program, Andrei Frankovic, Claire Sidoti, for making this webinar happening. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.